A luxury office lobby in New York City. Panic, noise, confusion. A little girl screams uncontrollably, her voice echoing off the marble walls. Security stands frozen. Staff whisper in fear. No one knows what to do. She throws everything near her. Tablets, flowers, decor. It's a complete meltdown. Her mother rushes in. Victoria Laurent, the billionaire CEO. She is powerful, but here she is helpless. Then, from the corner, a janitor steps forward, calm, quiet, unnoticed. He kneels beside the child and says one simple thing, and suddenly, everything goes silent. The secret is out. Destiny begun. True peace has finally arrived today. Silence is the truth. Victoria Laurent was a woman who moved through the world with the absolute unyielding precision of a diamond-tipped blade. At 36, she was the CEO of Laurent Global, a multi-billion-dollar empire that specialized in high-frequency trading and cutting-edge logistics. She lived her life in 60-minute increments, her schedule a masterpiece of efficiency and clinical control. In the boardrooms of Manhattan, she was known as the Iron Queen, a leader who could stabilize a falling stock market with a single phone call or dismantle a competitor with a whisper. She believed that every problem had a logic-based solution, and every crisis could be managed if you had enough data and enough authority. To Victoria, the world was a machine, and she was its most competent operator. She woke up every morning at 4 a.m., running through a meticulously planned routine of cold plunges, market reviews, and intense physical training. She viewed her emotions as unnecessary data noise, variables that needed to be suppressed to maintain her upward trajectory. Her office on the 82nd floor was a fortress of glass and steel, where the air was filtered and the silence was expensive. She had built this empire from nothing after her father's business collapsed, driven by a primal fear of being vulnerable again. She was the person everyone looked to when the world was falling apart, the anchor in the storm of global economics. But on this Tuesday afternoon, in the gleaming, gold-trimmed lobby of her own world headquarters, Victoria Laurent realized that her billions were worth absolutely nothing. She was standing in the center of a psychological storm that no amount of venture capital or executive authority could quiet. Her 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, was in the midst of a catastrophic emotional meltdown. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a child seeking attention, a candy bar, or a new toy. No, it was a complete sensory collapse. Sophia was a child of incredible, almost painful sensitivity, a girl who processed the world with the volume turned up to an unbearable, distorted level. She had been brought to the office unexpectedly because her elite private school had closed due to a sudden, localized power outage, and the high-pressure environment of the corporate lobby had quickly become a sensory battlefield. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture, acres of white Carrara marble, towering glass panes, and brushed gold accents. To the world-renowned architects, it was a temple of progress and prestige, but to Sophia, it was a nightmare of aggressive, stabbing stimuli. The constant, sharp ping of elevator doors, the frantic, staccato clicking of high heels on the stone floors, the cloying scent of 50 different expensive perfumes, and the glaring, white-hot artificial lights reflecting off every polished surface had pushed her central nervous system over a jagged edge. She was screaming, a high-pitched, jagged sound that tore through the air like a siren in a narrow canyon. She was on the floor, her small hands covering her ears so tightly her knuckles were white, her body vibrating with a terror that made her lunge at anyone who tried to approach. She had already knocked over a massive ceramic vase of lilies and swiped a tablet from a receptionist's desk, sending glass and electronics shattering across the floor like shrapnel. The security team, men trained in advanced martial arts and tactical response to stop intruders, stood in a helpless, embarrassed semicircle. They were terrified of touching her, terrified of making the screaming worse, and terrified of their boss's legendary, bone-chilling temper. The staff watched from behind glass partitions, whispering in hushed, judgmental tones about the billionaire's spoiled brat and the failure of modern parenting. They didn't see a child in agonizing neurological pain. They saw a disruption to their orderly, high-frequency world. They saw a lack of discipline in a room that demanded absolute compliance. Victoria rushed into the lobby, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence she hadn't felt since her first public offering. She dropped her $5,000 designer handbag and knelt on the cold marble, reaching out for her daughter. "Sophia, stop it! You're making a scene. Please look at Mommy." Her voice was sharp, laced with a mixture of desperate love and public humiliation. She tried to grab Sophia's wrist to keep her from hitting the floor, but the girl shrieked and recoiled with animalistic fear, her eyes wild, dilated, and completely unfocused. Victoria tried to use her CEO voice, the voice that commanded boards of directors and 10,000 employees, to bring order to the chaos. "Sophia, I need you to calm down right now. This behavior is unacceptable." It only made it worse. To Sophia, her mother's voice was just another sharp, piercing needle in an environment already full of them. The more Victoria tried to solve the problem with control and volume, the deeper Sophia retreated into the panic. Victoria felt a sickening, hollow sense of powerlessness. She could navigate a hostile takeover across 3 different time zones, but she couldn't reach her own child across 3 feet of marble. She looked around the room, her eyes pleading with her staff for a solution, but she found only blank stares and hidden smirks. She was the most powerful woman in the city, and she was drowning in the middle of her own lobby. The Iron Queen was crumbling, and for the first time in her life, the silence she usually commanded was replaced by a noise she couldn't stop. Daniel Hayes was a man who lived in the quiet, dusty margins of the building's monumental success. At 42, his presence was measured not by the noise he made, but by the profound, steady silence he left behind. He was a shadow moving through the salt-crusted, wind-whipped hallways of Lauren Global. To the executives who rushed past him every evening, he was simply the man with the mop, an invisible, sentient component of the building's infrastructure. He was as unremarkable to them as the recessed lighting or the HVAC vents that kept their air climate controlled. He wore a navy blue canvas work jacket with a faded name tag, his hands calloused by industrial chemicals and the weight of a life he never planned for. But Daniel carried a history that no one in that glass tower bothered to ask about. Before the blue canvas and the bucket of gray water, he had been a specialized technical sergeant in a military search and rescue unit, a man trained to maintain absolute calm in high-stress environments where a single frantic movement could mean the difference between a mission's success and a total loss of life. He understood the physics of fear and the chemistry of panic. He had pulled people from burning aircraft and crumbling buildings, and he knew that the loudest scream often came from the deepest hurt. But more importantly, Daniel was a single dad. He was raising a 9-year-old son, Noah, who had spent the first 6 years of his life battling the exact same kind of sensory processing storms that were currently consuming Sophia. Daniel's wife, Sarah, had been a pediatric therapist, the woman who had taught him how to see the world through Noah's eyes. When she passed away 4 years ago, Daniel was left with a grieving heart and a son who felt everything too much. He realized that the high-stakes world of technical engineering he was qualified for would steal his time and his presence. He walked away from a 6-figure salary to take this cleaning job because the night shift allowed him to be there for Noah during the day, to walk him to school, to attend his therapy sessions, and to be the first face Noah saw when the world felt too loud. He was a man who had traded his ambition for his son's peace, and he had never regretted the trade for a single second. Daniel was currently emptying the industrial shredders near the service elevator when the screaming started. He didn't rush toward the noise like the security guards, driven by duty or ego. He stayed back, leaning his mop against the wall, watching the scene with the clinical, empathetic observation of a man who had been in those same trenches many times before. He saw Victoria's frantic, erratic attempts at control. He heard the sharp, attacking tone of her voice. He saw the way the security guards were crowding the girl's personal space, creating a physical cage of suits and radio static that only amplified Sophia's terror. He smelled the ozone from the elevators and the overwhelming scent of lilies, a trigger he knew all too well. He didn't see a billionaire's daughter or a spoiled child. He saw a drowning soul in an ocean of light and sound. He recognized the way Sophia's eyes were fixed on the flickering fluorescent bulb above the reception desk. He noticed the way she flinched at the rhythmic ding of the elevator. He saw the exact moment her central nervous system had surrendered to the stimuli and shut down all logic. He waited. He knew that in a moment of peak chaos, the arrival of another authority figure would only add fuel to the fire. He waited for the energy in the room to hit its absolute ceiling, the point where Victoria finally stopped shouting and just sat there on her knees, her face buried in her hands in a moment of total, public surrender. Slowly, Daniel began to move. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't even adjust his work jacket. He walked with a slow, heavy, and deliberate pace that seemed to lower the frequency of the air around him. It was a rhythmic gait, a grounding pulse that ignored the frantic energy of the room. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at the security guards who were eyeing him with confusion and annoyance. His entire focus was a laser beam directed at the child on the floor. As he approached, the head of security stepped forward, his hand out in a sharp stop gesture. "Hey, buddy, back off. We've got this under control. Get back to your wing." Daniel didn't even stop walking. He didn't argue. He just looked the guard in the eye with a gaze that was so steady, so ancient, and so unshakable that the man's hand slowly dropped to his side. It was the look of a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer afraid of a man in a silk tie. The guard stepped back, instinctively sensing that he was no longer the most capable person in the room. Daniel stopped exactly 6 feet away from Sophia. He didn't enter her immediate threat zone. He didn't tower over her. He slowly, rhythmically lowered himself onto the marble floor. He sat there, legs crossed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He became a part of the floor. He became a stationary, non-threatening object in a world of moving predators. He wasn't doing anything. He was just being. He was providing a human anchor in a sea of white noise. He looked at Sophia, not with judgment, and not with the frantic, performative pity of her mother, but with a simple, quiet recognition. He was a father, and in this moment, he was home. If you believe every child deserves a guardian, type, "I still show up." The lobby of Laurent Global became a vacuum of sound for a few long, agonizing seconds. The only noise was the ragged, desperate gasps of Sophia's breathing and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Victoria Laurent looked up from her hands, her expensive mascara smudged, her eyes wide with a combination of shock and rising indignation. She watched the janitor, a man she had likely walked past 1,000 times without a single nod of acknowledgement, sitting on the floor of her multi-billion-dollar lobby as if he were in a public park. She opened her mouth to tell him to get away, to call the police, to demand he get back to work, but the words died in her throat. There was something about the way he sat, the absolute granite-like stillness of his body, that made her feel like any sound she made would be a crime against the peace he was trying to build. Daniel didn't look at Victoria. He kept his eyes on a spot on the floor, about 6 inches in front of Sophia's feet. He began to hum, a low, deep, and vibrating sound that was more of a physical frequency than a melody. It was a grounding tone, the kind of sub-bass sound a mother whale makes to her calf in deep, dark water. Sophia's screaming had turned into a low, rhythmic moan. She was still covering her ears, but her eyes, previously wild and darting like a trapped bird, suddenly snapped to Daniel. She saw him. She saw the man in the blue jacket who wasn't moving, wasn't shouting, and wasn't trying to grab her. She saw the man who looked like he understood the crushing weight of the air. She saw someone who wasn't asking anything of her. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor rather than through the air itself. He didn't use a condescending baby voice, and he didn't use a command. He said 4 simple words that cut through 7 years of clinical misunderstanding and expensive therapy sessions. "It's too loud, isn't it?" Sophia froze. The moan stopped instantly. She slowly, tentatively lowered one hand from her ear, as if testing the atmosphere for invisible spikes. She looked at Daniel with a look of profound, heart-shattering relief. It was the first time in her life a stranger had identified the monster she was fighting. It wasn't bad behavior. It wasn't a lack of discipline. It was noise. It was the world. It was the sensory overload that felt like a physical assault on her soul. Yes, Sophia whispered, her voice tiny, fragile, and sounding like a ghost. Daniel offered a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that only comes from someone who has shared the same battle and carries the same scars. I know, he said softly. The lights are like needles, the floor is like glass, and everyone's voices are like hammers. It's a lot to carry for a little girl. It's a lot for anyone. He reached into his pocket, not quickly, but with a slow, exaggerated motion to show he wasn't a threat, and pulled out a pair of industrial-grade, neon blue noise-canceling earmuffs, the kind he wore when he was operating the heavy, roaring floor buffers at 3 a.m. He didn't try to put them on her. He simply set them on the floor between them, like a peace offering between two warring nations. You don't have to stop feeling, Sophia, Daniel continued, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. You just need to turn the world down for a minute. You can put these on if you want, or you can just stay here with me. I'm not going anywhere. We can just sit here on this floor until the hammers stop. No one is allowed to touch you. Sophia looked at the earmuffs, then at Daniel. She crawled forward, not toward her mother, but toward the janitor. She picked up the heavy muffs and slid them over her ears. The silence that followed was visible on her face. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up to her chin, dropped an inch. Her jaw loosened. She let out a long, shuddering exhale that sounded like the end of a very long war. Daniel didn't move to hug her. He didn't try to fix the mess she had made or clean the broken lilies. He just stayed there, breathing slowly and deeply. Just breathe with me, Sophia, like this, in and out, like the waves on the sand. Sophia began to match his rhythm. She watched his chest rise and fall, and she copied him. Slowly, the frantic energy that had filled the lobby began to drain away, replaced by a heavy, necessary calm. The security guards looked at each other, confused and profoundly embarrassed. The staff turned back to their computers. The show over. Victoria Laurent stood up slowly, her legs trembling from the adrenaline crash. She walked over to the two of them, but she didn't interrupt. She stood a safe distance away, watching a man with a mop do what all her power, all her billions, and all her world-class therapists couldn't. She saw her daughter sitting quietly, holding the sleeve of the janitor's work jacket, her eyes closed, finally at peace. Victoria felt a sharp, burning pang of shame, not for the scene her daughter had made, but for the devastating realization that she had been a complete stranger to her own child's pain. She had been trying to rule Sophia like a company, when all Sophia needed was someone to sit in the dark with her and recognize the noise. The entire lobby was silent, but for the first time in her life, Victoria realized that silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of understanding. She looked at Daniel's calloused hands and the way he held himself with such quiet dignity. She realized that the most valuable asset in her multi-billion-dollar building wasn't her high-frequency algorithms. It was the man who knew how to listen to the silence. Respect isn't given, it's carried. Comment, I carry mine. The lobby had returned to its habitual, low-frequency hum of corporate life. But for Victoria Laurent, the architecture of her reality had been permanently altered. She watched as Daniel Hayes slowly stood up, helping Sophia to her feet with a gentle, grounding hand that didn't squeeze or pull. Sophia was still wearing the neon blue industrial earmuffs, looking like a little astronaut who had finally found her oxygen supply in deep space. She wouldn't let go of Daniel's sleeve. Victoria stepped closer, her professional mask lying in pieces on the marble floor. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the depth of character in the weathered lines of his face. She saw a man who didn't care about her title. How did you do that? She asked, her voice hushed, stripped of all its executive steel. My daughter has seen the best specialists in the country. We've had teams of elite nannies and behavioral experts. We've spent hundreds of thousands on therapies. No one has ever been able to reach her like that. Daniel adjusted his name tag, his expression humble but unshakable. You can't reach someone if you're too busy trying to pull them back up to your level, Miss Laurent. You have to be willing to go down to theirs. You have to meet them where the air is thin. He explained briefly and without an ounce of ego about his son Noah. He told her about the years of sensory storms in their Brooklyn apartment and the realization that his son wasn't broken. He was just receiving more data than his biological system could handle. I didn't fix her, Daniel said softly, looking down at Sophia with a tenderness that made Victoria's heart ache. I just let her know I heard the noise too. Once a child knows they aren't alone in the chaos starts to lose its power. It becomes just a storm, not the end of the world. Victoria felt a lump in her throat. She looked at the calloused, stained hands of the man before her and realized that the manual laborer she had initially looked down upon was the most sophisticated person she had ever met. He had a PhD in empathy, a degree that couldn't be bought at Harvard or earned in a boardroom. I've spent so much time being a leader, Victoria admitted, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I forgot how to be a person who just listens. I was trying to control the meltdown because it was messy and inefficient. I was trying to manage her like a bad quarterly report instead of loving her through a crisis. I thought my power could buy her peace. Daniel gave a small, knowing nod. Control is for machines and spreadsheets, Miss Laurent. People need understanding, especially the little ones who feel everything at once. They don't need a CEO. They need a floor. They need to know that even if they fall apart, the ground is solid. Victoria realized that her Iron Queen persona was just another form of noise, a defense mechanism she used to avoid her own vulnerability. She saw that Daniel's quiet strength came from a place of absolute integrity. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to dominate to be powerful. He carried a kingdom of peace inside him that she would trade her entire empire to own. If understanding matters more than control, type, I listen. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The billionaire CEO was now the student, and the janitor was the master of the only subject that truly mattered. Victoria realized that the most valuable asset in her multi-billion-dollar building wasn't the proprietary software or the high-frequency algorithms. It was the man who knew how to stay calm when the world was screaming. She saw a hero in him, not for a grand act of physical bravery, but for the quiet, consistent strength of his character. Sophia finally removed the heavy earmuffs. She looked up at Daniel and gave him a small, shy smile. The kind of genuine, unshielded smile Victoria hadn't seen in months. Thank you, Mr. Dan, Sophia said, her voice clear, grounded, and no longer haunted by the scream. Daniel winked at her, a private gesture of solidarity. Anytime, Sophia. Remember, if it gets too loud again, just find your sanctuary tree in your mind, or just breathe like a wave on the sand. The hammers can't hit a wave. He looked at Victoria and gave a respectful, formal nod, ready to melt back into the shadows of his shift and pick up his mop. Wait, Victoria called out. She reached for her handbag, the old instinct to pay for a service flare-up, but she caught herself just in time. She didn't offer him a check, a promotion, or a reward. She offered him her hand. I'd like to meet your son, Daniel, and I'd like to learn more about how you see the world. We need more than just cleaners in this building. We need people who can see the truth. Daniel took her hand, his grip firm, honest, and entirely equal. Noah would like that. He's a good kid. He just sees things differently than most people. He's my hero. Victoria knelt down beside Sophia, matching Daniel's posture from earlier. She didn't try to grab her or force a hug. She just waited. Slowly, Sophia reached out and took her mother's hand. The connection was real. It wasn't a command from a CEO. It was an invitation from a mother who was finally learning how to listen to the silence. Final scene. As Victoria and Sophia walked toward the heavy glass doors of the tower, Sophia turned back and waved at Daniel. He was already back at his cart, picking up his mop, becoming the invisible man once again. But as the sun set over the Manhattan skyline, casting a golden, divine glow through the lobby, Daniel Hayes didn't look like a janitor. He looked like a man who had just saved a kingdom, one breath at a time. He walked back to the service elevator, humming that same low, grounding frequency. He had a shift to finish and a son to wake up for school in the morning. He didn't need the spotlight. He was the one who kept the floor steady while everyone else was busy looking at the stars. He was the guardian of the silence. 2 weeks later, Victoria Laurent announced a major new initiative, the Laurent Foundation for Neurodiversity. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a mission to build schools and environments that understood the noise. And the first person she consulted was the night maintenance lead of her building. Daniel stayed at his job. He liked the quiet of the night, but he was no longer invisible. Every time Victoria walked through that lobby, she stopped to say hello. Not as a CEO to an employee, but as one parent to another, sharing the secret of the waves. They tried to control her. They tried to stop the chaos with authority, noise, and fear. But what she needed wasn't a CEO. It was a father who knew how to listen to the silence behind the scream. Daniel Hayes proved that the most powerful person in a room full of billionaires is the one who understands that the heart doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be heard. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Chip Healing Stories, where the quietest voices tell the most powerful stories.